Hello, and welcome to the History Inquirer. Today, we will be talking about the events leading up to the American Revolution, starting in 1763 and ending in 1775. So sit back, relax, and grab a drink as I take you down the road to the American Revolution. The year was 1763. The French and Indian War had just been won, and the American colonists were looking forward to a return to normalcy, the way things had been before the war. Although not completely, because the British had won quite a bit of territory from the French that they were looking to expand into. However, that was not to be the case because that same year, the British Crown issued a proclamation prohibiting Southern encroachment on native lands. They also decided to organize newly acquired territories in Quebec, East and West Florida, and Grenada, in addition to the massive Indian reservation west of the Appalachian Mountains, east of the Mississippi River, south of Hudson Bay, and north of Florida. As the document says, and whereas it is just and reasonable and essential to our interests and the security of our colonies that the several nations or tribes of Indians with whom we are connected and who live under our protection should not be molested or disturbed in possession of such parts of our dominions and territories as, not having been ceded to or purchased by us, are reserved to them, or any of them, as their hunting grounds. And whereas great funds and abuses had been committed in purchasing lands of the Indians to the great prejudice of our interests and to the great dissatisfaction of the said Indians, in order, therefore, to prevent such irregularities for the future, and to the end that the Indians may be convinced of our justice and determined resolution to remove all reasonable cause of discontent, we do, with the advice of our Privy Council, strictly enjoin and require that no private person do presume to make any purchase from the said Indians of any lands reserved to the said Indians, within those parts of our colonies where we have thought proper to allow settlements. But that if any time any of the said Indians should be inclined to dispose of the said lands, that same shall be purchased only for us, in our name, at some public meeting or assembly of the said Indians, to be held for that purpose by the governor or commander-in-chief of our colony, respectively, within which they shall lie. And that's from the Proclamation of 1763. So basically, the lands of the natives are theirs to do with as they please, and if they wish to sell their land, then a meeting can be arranged to purchase the land for colonial settlement. Now, this all sounds very reasonable. However, the American colonists had just fought a war against the French and the Indians, as well as Pontiac's War shortly after, from 1763 to 64, video from another time, perhaps. But yeah, they just fought a war for this land. They fought and bled and died for these lands. And now here's the British government telling them that they can't go in there and settle. Now, this also represented British interference in the affairs of the colonies. Now, the war had also left the British with a massive amount of debt, and they needed a way to raise money. Unfortunately for the colonists, that meant taxes, which they did not vote for or want, or have representation in Parliament. More on that later. Now, unfortunately for the colonists, that meant taxes. For the British perspective, the colonists are British subjects and should contribute to their defense. Very reasonable. But the colonists had no representative in Parliament representing them and their interests. That was the main problem, the main issue. Enter Sugar Act of 1764. Now, Great Britain, in an effort to end the smuggling of sugar and molasses and to increase revenue, passed the Sugar Act of 1764. This placed a 3-penny tax on non-British sources of sugar and molasses. New regulations were put in place, and customs commissioners were hired to collect and enforce them. Those who failed to pay duties or violated the trade rules were placed under the authority of the Vice Admiralty Courts in Nova Scotia. Nova Scotia. Not Boston, not New York, not Philadelphia, but Nova Scotia. Anybody see any problem with that? Now, the Sugar Act, unlike the previous Molasses Act of 1733, was permanent and not subject for review or debate or something like that. And many felt that it violated their rights as Englishmen. Now, American colonists refused to buy British goods in response. And that said, since the act did not affect all Americans, mostly merchants, protests were low. However, that would change the following year with the passage of the Stamp Act and the Quartering Act. Now, the Stamp Act was the first direct tax on American colonists to raise revenue. It was a tax on all paper documents, including marriage certificates, newspapers, wills, diplomas, playing cards, etc. While the Sugar Act was passed by Parliament smoothly, there was opposition to the Stamp Act by one Colonel Isaac Bear of Anglo-Irish descent, who spoke out against George Grenville and Charles Townshend, who called the American colonists children planted by care and nursed up by us, and very paternal. But Colonel Isaac Bear, he spoke out against them, saying, "They planted by your care? No. Your oppression planted them in America. They fled from your tyranny to a then uncultivated and inhospitable country where they exposed themselves to almost all hardships to which human nature is liable. They nursed up by your indulgence. They grew up by your neglected them. As soon as you began to care about them, that care was exercised in sending persons to rule over them, to spy out their liberty, to misrepresent their actions, and to prey upon them. Men whose behavior on many occasions has caused the blood of these sons of liberty to recoil within them." Unquote. Nevertheless, it passed, and the colonists were outraged because it violated their rights as Englishmen to not be taxed without their consent. Parliament, on the other hand, saw the American colonists as being no different than those in England who did not own land and so could not vote. Let this sink in. So you're American colonists, you own land, you participate in the colonial assembly, right? And yet Parliament is treating you like a landless peasant. Really? So you can see what an insult it is for Parliament to then claim that they virtually represent you. No. And as I said, the protests, riots, and other actions taken by the Sons of Liberty, which was formed in response to all of this. It also led to the popular rallying cry of no taxation without representation. In the Virginia House of Burgesses, a 29-year-old Patrick Henry, in his first session, proposed resolutions against the Stamp Act called the Virginia Resolves, which stated that the American colonists reserved the right to tax themselves as fellow Englishmen. Later in 1775, and later in 1775, he would give his famous "Give me liberty or give me death" speech at the Second Virginia Convention, but that was still in the future. Now, similar resolutions to this were passed in other colonial assemblies. In October of that year, the Stamp Act Congress was called in New York to put together petitions to be sent to King and Parliament to address grievances. And they're kind of afraid of this because here the colonists are unified in this. Okay, presenting a united front. And they didn't expect this. However, Parliament rejected these petitions. However, due to pressure from British merchants, Parliament decided to repeal the Stamp Act. However, Parliament also passed the Declaratory Act in 1766, which stated that Parliament had the authority to make laws in the colonies, and I quote, "in all cases whatsoever." This would open the door for more taxes, such as the Townshend Act and the Intolerable Acts. But first, let's talk about the Quartering Act. So while the uproar over the Stamp Act was going on, Parliament decided to pass the Quartering Act, which said that the 13 colonies were required to provide housing, food, drink, etc. to British soldiers stationed there. Now, this might mean building a barracks or using a warehouse or other public building to house these soldiers. It wasn't until 1774 that colonists were required to house the British soldiers on private property inside their homes, making it much more personal. And you can see why that'd be included in the Declaration of Independence. Now it's time to discuss the Townshend Acts of 1767 to 68. Now in 1767, Parliament passed the Townshend Acts, sponsored by Robert Townshend, or Charles Townshend, I should say. Not Robert. Now the Revenue Act issued new taxes to raise revenue for the British Crown on items such as lead, glass, paper, paint, and of course, tea. The Commissioners of Customs Act established a customs board which gave the customs officials more power. The Indemnity Act made the tea imported from the British East India Company cheaper than the tea smuggled in by the Dutch and other countries. The New York Restraining Act suspended the New York Assembly until it complied with the Quartering Act. Finally, the Vice Admiralty Court Act in 1768 created a new series of courts where the trials would be conducted by a judge as opposed to a colonial jury to curtail smuggling. And these judges were more likely to find the defendant guilty. Okay? And the sentences would be harsher as well. So these acts threatened colonial self-government by enacting more taxes without colonial consent. As a result, violent protests and riots broke out, as well as boycotts on British goods. George Washington aided in putting together a non-importation agreement of British goods, and Virginia and other colonies followed suit, especially in Massachusetts. In 1770, with the effectiveness of the boycott being uneven, the Sons of Liberty began posting signs of importer on storefronts that failed to comply with the boycotts. When one Ebenezer Richardson tried to take one down, he was attacked by a group of boys and fled inside his house. George Wilmot came to his defense, and they then proceeded to arm themselves with muskets and confront the boys. Now, Richardson's musket ended up going off and killed an 11-year-old boy named Christopher Sater, which increased tensions between the colonists and the British. This would lead to the Boston Massacre. A crowd of angry Bostonians roamed the streets on the night of March 5th, 1770. Their anger fueled by rumors that the British soldiers were planning to cut down the Liberty Tree in South Boston. The crowd pelted the barracks of the soldiers with snowballs and then turned on the lone sentry outside of the customs house. In response, Captain Thomas Preston led his men out with fixed bayonets to rescue the sentry and disperse the crowd. The crowd proceeded to pelt the troops with ice, snowballs, and oyster shells, daring them to fire. Then one soldier finally did, followed by the rest who thought the order had been given. 3 were killed immediately, including Crispus Attucks, a free black sailor. More were wounded, with 2 dying from their wounds. Preston and his men were placed under arrest, and when the trial was held, they were defended by none other than future President John Adams. He won acquittal for Preston and all but 2 of his men, whose sentences were negotiated down to manslaughter and then to the branding of their thumbs as first offenders. In the following month, the Townshend Acts were repealed, except for the tax on tea. This would lead to the Boston Tea Party. The Boston Tea Party occurred on December 16th, 1773. Prior to this, Parliament had passed the Tea Act, which made the British tea cheaper than their competitors. This, in addition to the tax on importation from the Townshend Acts, increased tensions between the British and the colonists. This led to boycotts, tea being left sitting on the dock, tea being sent back to England, and of course, the famous Boston Tea Party. On December 16, 1773, members of the Sons of Liberty, dressed up as Mohawk Indians, stormed British merchant vessels and threw 342 chests of tea into Boston Harbor. The loss of tea resulted in revenue shortfall equivalent to $3 million today. They then proceeded to raid warehouses and tar and feather customs officials. And these warehouses that they raided were carrying tea. Okay. And when the British learned of this, they were appalled, and Parliament passed what became known as the Intolerable Acts, or Coercive Acts, in 1774 in response. These laws aimed to punish Massachusetts, in particular for the Boston Tea Party. By closing Boston Harbor until reparations were paid, restricting local self-government, and allowing royal officials accused of crimes to be tried in Britain rather than in the colonies. The act also expanded the power of the royal governor and limited the activities of town meetings, effectively curtailing colonial autonomy and inflaming widespread resentment throughout the 13 colonies. These restrictions prompted colonial leaders to organize resistance on a larger scale. In September 1774, delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies convened in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress. The assembly marked the beginning of formal collaboration among the colonies as delegates coordinated responses, drafted petitions to the king, and agreed upon imposing economic sanctions on British goods. Their efforts were focused on restoring colonial rights and seeking compromise, but also on preparing for further conflict if reconciliation failed. Local militias were formed. Munitions were stockpiled throughout the colonies, preparing for outbreak of war, which would come in the following year of 1775, with the battles of Lexington and Concord, and a shot heard around the world, igniting the American Revolution. More on that in the next video. Thank you all for watching. Please remember to like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you all next time on History Inquirer. Thank you.